So this whole admittedly weird conversation about Gen Z and how they're aging has given me an opportunity to talk about something way more fun, but still relevant, and it has to do with professional wrestling. This, in figure form, is a man by the name of Arn Anderson, and I am here to surmise today that a lot of the issue that millennials have with how Gen Z is aging and the comments we make and the things that we see that we think are strange can be explained away by what pro wrestling fans know as the Arn Anderson Paradox. For those who are in the scene, it's also sometimes known as the Greg Valentine conundrum. More on that later. And I want to let Gen Z know that while current conversations from millennials may seem, harsh and we're being kind of jerks or whatever, in the long run, this might work out for you, and I will explain why. Arn Anderson was a professional wrestler who rose to prominence in the early and mid 80s, eventually as part of what was called the Four Horsemen. Now, when Arn Anderson first came on the scene, he certainly had what we would call today an older look. He's only about 25 here. And he was a big star by the time he was 27. And this was in the 80s. So the slightly balding hair and the big beard and the chest hair and stuff like that, all of that was totally normal, in vogue. The biggest star of the day, Hulk Hogan, was like almost fully bald at this point. But by the 90s, the aesthetic of professional wrestling had started to change, just like it had culturally. So Arn Anderson continues to wrestle, and he's got that burly look and edge, and it kind of helped him because he was known as the enforcer. He was supposed to be the gruff guy. But eventually he gets injured, and by 1997, he's about to retire. And this is where, for me, the contrast becomes really apparent. By 1997, especially like on WWF, the look of wrestlers has completely changed. You got Shawn Michaels. You got Stone Cold Steve Austin, who was balding, but now shaves his head to look like a tough guy. And here you have Arn Anderson coming out for his retirement. When Arn Anderson gets injured and goes to retire, he comes out to give this speech. And from my perspective as a teenager at this time, he looks like my grandpa. Because those wired frame glasses had started to go out of fashion, and letting yourself bald gracefully had gone out of fashion. And a lot of guys had understood this. Ric Flair, who's standing behind him there, is 10 years older than Arn Anderson, but just if you take the snapshot, might look younger. Hulk Hogan had tanned and tanned and tanned his whole life. He almost refused to take his sunglasses off and his bandana off. He dyed his beard because it made him look younger, and he surrounded himself with younger people. Arn Anderson, in his retirement, is only 40 years old, the same age as I am. But based on the aesthetic that I grew up in and know, he looks old. He looks like my grandpa. My grandpa was in his 60s at this point. Because for a lot of millennials, we have come to associate this look with being very much from the 80s. So in 1997, Arn Anderson looked like a relic of the 80s. We didn't realize he was 40 years old. I thought he was 50 or 60 at this point. Now, before anyone comes for me, I can realize that means a lot of the things that I still associate with like a youthful look like relics to Gen Z. I'm just trying to explain away why we're having this back and forth on who looks older. And for us, it's because so much of like Gen Z and their aesthetic and their choices looks like it comes out of the 80s. Now, I realize that 2002 was 22 years ago, and that means that Gen Z thinks I look like a relic too. I get it. And in wrestling, Arn Anderson and Greg Valentine have come to be known as these guys. They looked 40 when they were 20, so then they looked 40 when they were 40. But here's the kicker, and here's where Gen Z, as we all get older, millennials get older and Gen Z gets older, here's where Gen Z probably wins the day. Because Arn Anderson and Greg Valentine looked 40 when they were 20, and then sort of caught up to look 40, well, guess what? They looked like old men then, so now as actual old men, I think they look great. This is Arn Anderson today. And yes, Arn Anderson looks like a grandpa, and he is a grandpa. But as someone who grew up with Arn Anderson his whole life, my vision of Arn Anderson is that he should be old and decrepit and broken down. Instead, he looks like a pretty healthy grandpa. And now he is in his mid-60s, and I actually think he looks really, really good. But for me, it's because he looked old early. I assumed he was older, and now I'm like, oh my gosh, that guy looks so great because he looks almost the same to me as he did 25 years ago. Look, I'm not foolish enough to tell you that with like 2024 vision, I can't see that this obviously was a younger man. It was, but it was buried under aesthetics that I thought were old. This is where we apply Gen Z. Gen Z has taken on a lot of aesthetic choices that to millennials especially look old. They look like stuff out of the 80s. Now, that makes sense for Gen Z because they have no frame of reference for that. But the wire glasses and the mullets and things like that make us feel like you're aging. And Gen Z, to their credit, have adopted a lot more fashion choices that are more natural. I see a lot more men embracing a pretty natural looking beard and natural looking hair, women embracing natural hair, and a lot of women at least, more natural faces and things like that. Obviously, there's always gonna be people who try to be made up like Barbie dolls and things like that. But for a lot, we just accept what we look like. And all that's good stuff, but I am telling you, those style choices remind us of our grandparents, and we will continue to have this sort of back and forth as long as those aesthetics are at play with each other. And for me, I will just do my best to remember Arn Anderson and Greg Valentine and say, well, I look at Gen Z sometimes and go, oh my gosh, they look 40. Well, they've looked 40 since they were 20. They'll probably look 40 when they're 40, and then they'll look 40 when they're 60, and I am buried maybe.